Snow drifted across the Ardennes like ashes from a dying fire. The forest was silent, except for the distant growl of engines rolling through the frozen mist. Sergeant William Bill Carter leaned out of his Sherman tank's hatch, the metal so cold it bit his fingers through his gloves. The smell of diesel and cordite hung in the air, the smell of a battlefield not yet finished with its dying. He pressed the throat mic to his lips. "All tanks, report in." Static answered him. Then one voice came through, thin and cracked. "This is Lucky Star, still with you." Another, calmer. "Steel Faith, ready." Then silence. Only 5 of them left. 5 tanks holding a crossroads against an army. Carter's gunner, Joe Marino, glanced up from the turret, his face pale. "They said how many are coming?" Carter hesitated. 40. The word fell heavy. Like a sentence. They'd been ordered to hold the line for 2 hours, long enough for the 3rd Armored to regroup behind them. But communications were down, air support grounded by snow, and artillery too far to help. The enemy was coming in force. Panzer IVs, half-tracks, and even rumors of a Tiger battalion. Carter's loader, Tommy Hughes, tried to make a joke. 5 against 40, huh? Those are Vegas odds." No one laughed. He looked around at his men. They were young, too young. Marino barely 20, Tommy 22. Red Miller driving the tank with hands that never stopped shaking. They'd been fighting together since Normandy. They'd survived ambushes, mines, and artillery. But this time they all knew. Survival wasn't on the menu. The wind shifted, carrying a sound that made every man freeze, the low metallic thunder of tank treads, dozens of them, slow, confident, closing in. Carter closed the hatch, sealing the crew inside. The world shrank to steel walls, dim light, and the hum of the engine. "Button up, boys," he said quietly. "Let's make them think hell just woke up." Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, muting the sounds of war. Through the periscope, Carter saw movement. Shadows in the white-black crosses painted on gray armor. The 1st Panzer appeared at the edge of the village. Behind it came more. Carter's voice was calm. "Gunner, load armor-piercing. Aim low. Take out the lead track." Marino's hands moved by instinct, sliding the heavy shell into the breech. The gun roared. The recoil slammed through the tank like a heartbeat. The Panzer's treads shattered, its hull sliding sideways into a ditch. "Good hit," Tommy shouted. Then in the distance, another German tank fired. The shells screamed past, exploding behind them. Dirt and snow rained down on the Sherman. Carter didn't flinch. "We hold this road. Nobody gets through." Over the next few seconds, the radio came alive with desperate voices. Tanks calling out positions, hits, losses. One after another, they fell silent. And then there were 5. Only 5. Carter wiped frost from his periscope and whispered to himself, "We're the wall, and the wall doesn't move." The ground shook again. The Panzers were advancing, black silhouettes in the snow, 40 to 5. The air filled with thunder. Somewhere in the chaos, Tommy muttered a prayer. Marino loaded another shell. Carter gave a single order. "Fire!" The gun thundered again, echoing across the valley. The battle for the crossroads had begun. 12 hours earlier, before the horizon burned with fire and steel, Sergeant Carter's platoon had rolled into the tiny Belgian village of Stavelot. The streets were narrow, the houses old and low, and every window seemed to hide eyes that knew the storm was coming. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the ground was hard enough to crack under the weight of the tanks. Lieutenant Abrams, their commanding officer, stood beside his jeep, maps spread across the hood, breath curling into the cold air. "The Krauts are pushing through the forest with armor and infantry," he said. "We're the plug in the bottle. We hold this road, or the whole division gets rolled up." Carter looked at the map. The red arrows were thick, curling like blood veins toward their position. "How long are we supposed to hold?" he asked. Abrams gave a thin smile. "Until someone relieves you." Carter knew what that meant. No one was coming soon. Their 5 Shermans weren't the best the Army had. They were older M4A3 models, their armor thin, their guns weaker than the long-barreled 88s on the Panzers. But they had one advantage: mobility. Carter planned to use it like a knife. He gathered his crew by Liberty Bell, their tank. "We fight smart. We make them think there's more of us. We move after every shot, never stay still long enough for them to aim." Marino grinned nervously. "So we play hide-and-seek with tigers?" "Yeah," Carter said. "Except when we lose, we die." They set up positions along a ridge overlooking the crossroads, a narrow gap between 2 snow-covered hills. It was perfect for slowing armor, terrible for retreat. Behind them stretched 20 miles of forest and frozen roads. Red Miller, the driver, kicked the tracks to knock off ice. "We're low on gas again," he muttered. "Then don't waste it," Carter replied. At noon, the first enemy scouts appeared, 2 half-tracks and a motorcycle. Marino's gun spoke once, and both half-tracks went up in flames. The motorcycle swerved, skidded, and vanished in smoke. The Sherman's crew cheered, but Carter stayed quiet. That was the easy part. By mid-afternoon, radio chatter grew grim. Other Allied units were pulling back under pressure. Their flank was collapsing. They were alone now, 5 tanks against whatever the Germans sent next. In the distance, they could hear artillery, muffled by snow. Then came the low drone of engines. Not trucks. Something heavier. Dozens of them. Lieutenant Abrams radioed from his tank. "All units prepare to engage armor. Estimated strength, 40. Repeat, 40. Tommy whistled under his breath. 40 tanks? Carter's hand tightened on the radio. "Copy that. Holding position." When he looked up, the sky was already darkening, the snow thickening into a storm. They were blind, cold, and cut off. But they weren't broken. Not yet. As night fell, Carter's men ate from ration tins inside the tank, the sound of distant engines rolling through the woods like thunder. Marino said softly, "You think we can hold them?" Carter didn't answer. He just looked through the narrow slit of the periscope, at the road, the crossroads, the lifeline they were guarding. Finally, he said, "They'll come at dawn. We'll be ready." Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a warning. The trap was closing. Dawn came slow, gray, and silent. The world outside the tanks was a frozen graveyard of mist and snow. Inside Liberty Bell, condensation dripped from the metal roof, ticking like a clock counting down to death. Sergeant Carter sat in the commander's seat, headset pressed to his ears, listening to the static hum of a dead radio net. Every few seconds he tapped the side as if willing another voice to answer. None did. "Visibility?" he asked. Marino peered through his sight scope. "Maybe 200 yards. Fog's thick. If they're out there, we won't see them till they're kissing distance." Tommy chuckled dryly. "Guess we'll save ammo." Carter didn't smile. At 0613, Red Miller caught the sound first. Faint, rhythmic, unmistakable. "Tracks," he said. "A lot of them." Carter lifted his binoculars. Through the fog, dark shapes emerged. Half-tracks, light panzers, infantry moving behind them, their outlines ghost-like in the morning haze. "Hold fire," Carter ordered. "Wait till they're on the road." The Germans came in confident, unaware that 5 American tanks waited on the ridge above. They fanned out across the snow, their command half-track idling in the center of the road. Carter gave the order. "Target the lead vehicle. Fire when ready." The Sherman's 75mm gun roared. The lead half-track exploded in a fountain of fire and steel, scattering men into the ditches. Before the echo faded, the other Shermans joined in. Steel Faith took out the second truck. Lucky Star's shell ripped through an ammunition carrier, setting off a chain of detonations that tore open the valley. From the German radios came confusion. Voices shouted in panic. To them, it sounded like an ambush from a full armored company. "Keep changing positions," Carter yelled. "They'll think we've got 20 tanks up here." Each Sherman fired twice, then reversed 30 yards, tracks churning up snow and smoke. The tactic worked. From below, it looked like the ridge was alive with armor. The Germans fell back, retreating into the tree line, dragging wounded through the snow. For the moment, the field fell silent again. Inside Liberty Bell, the crew exhaled all at once. Tommy slapped Marino's shoulder. "Hell of a shot, Brooklyn." Marino grinned weakly. "Yeah. Remind me to tell my mom about it, if we live that long." But Carter wasn't celebrating. He knew the Germans wouldn't retreat twice. "They'll regroup," he said. "Send armor next time." He climbed halfway out of the hatch, scanning the tree line. The fog was lifting now, revealing the black scars of burning vehicles. It was a small victory, and a dangerous one. At 0840, they heard it. The deep, throaty rumble of heavy engines, not trucks, not half-tracks, tanks. "Here they come again," Red muttered. Through the clearing fog, Carter saw them, a line of German armor rolling forward. Panzer IVs with Tigers behind them, their turrets gleaming like predators in the snow. Marino whispered, "Jesus, they brought the big boys." Carter lowered his binoculars, his expression grim. "Then we hit the big boys first." The second battle for the crossroads had begun, the air filled with the mechanical growl of war, the smell of oil, and the sharp taste of fear. Carter keyed the radio. "All tanks, on my mark." He waited, counting heartbeats as the enemy rolled closer. "Now!" 5 Shermans fired at once, the sound shattering the dawn. The first shell hit a Panzer square in the turret, sending its hatch flying open like a lid from hell. Another German tank slewed sideways, its treads blown off. The others pushed forward through the wreckage, relentless. Inside Liberty Bell, Tommy yelled, "They're not stopping!" Carter gritted his teeth. "Neither are we." The fight for survival had truly begun. The ground trembled beneath them as the German armor rolled forward, not cautiously this time, but with the full confidence of numbers and steel. The snow muffled the sound, but the vibration reached through the soles of their boots and into their bones. 40 tanks advancing against 5. It wasn't a battle. It was an avalanche. Inside Liberty Bell, Sergeant Carter steadied himself as the tank shook. "Red, back us down 10 yards. Use the smoke for cover." The driver responded with a grunt, throwing the Sherman into reverse. Outside, white fog and gun smoke blurred the line between life and death. Through his scope, Gunner Joe Marino saw the lead Panzer crest the ridge. "Range 200, front armor." "Hold," Carter said calmly. "Wait for the belly shot." The Panzer fired first. The 88mm shell screamed past, gouging a crater yards away and throwing snow over the tank like shrapnel. "Now!" Marino fired. The Sherman's gun recoiled, the sound echoing off the valley walls. The shell struck under the Panzer's turret ring, not enough to destroy it, but enough to cripple its aim. "Hit!" Marino shouted. "Don't celebrate. Load again," Carter barked. Steel Faith fired next, its shells striking a second German tank square in the side. The vehicle erupted in flame, smoke curling into the frozen air. The Americans cheered briefly over the radio, until a return volley silenced Lucky Star. A Tiger's shell punched through its armor, detonating the ammunition inside. The explosion lit up the ridge. "Lucky Star's gone," Tommy yelled. "Keep firing," Carter snapped. The Germans fanned out, their formations tightening as they advanced. Panzer IVs took the flanks, while the Tigers held the center, methodical and merciless. The air filled with thunder. Marino switched to HE rounds, aiming for the infantry that followed the tanks. Shell after shell burst among them, scattering men into the snow. "Ammo count?" Carter asked. 20 rounds left, Tommy replied. After that, it's pistols and prayers. Carter exhaled slowly, eyes on the horizon. Then we make everyone count. The enemy was adapting now. The lead Tiger advanced under cover fire, its machine gun sweeping the ridge. A burst of tracers sparked off Liberty Bell's hull. Red cursed and ducked as a round tore through the driver's slit, grazing his arm. "I'm hit!" "How bad?" "Just blood, not death," he yelled back, gripping the controls. Carter radioed to Steel Faith. "Flank left and draw them in. Make them think we're falling back." The other Sherman surged forward, its tracks grinding through the snow. The Germans, seeing motion, redirected their guns, just as Carter planned. "Marino, Tiger, center mass, fire!" The shot rang out, striking the Tiger's exposed flank. The explosion shook the valley. Its turret lifted like a tossed coin before collapsing in smoke. Tommy whooped, "That's for Lucky Star!" But celebration was short-lived. Another shell tore through Steel Faith, splitting it open. Fire burst from the hatch. Carter turned away from the periscope, jaw clenched. They're gone. Now there were only 3 Shermans left. The Germans pressed harder, the battlefield shrinking with each minute. For every enemy tank they destroyed, 3 more pushed forward. The Americans fell back again, using burning wrecks as cover, the snow turning black with oil and ash. Inside Liberty Bell, the temperature rose from the heat of the engine and the fear that clung to every breath. Tommy reloaded, hands trembling. "Bill," he said quietly, "how much longer we gotta hold?" Carter didn't look at him. "Until the ammo's gone. Or we are." Outside, the thunder of the Panzers grew louder. The sky was a haze of fire and falling snow. For 3 hours, 5 Shermans had defied 40 German tanks. But now the line was cracking. Carter looked through his scope, watching the next wave approach. "They think they've got us," he said. "Let's make them earn it." And again, the gun roared. By the second hour, the air above the ridge was thick with smoke, snow, and the smell of burned oil. The ground was cratered and slick, torn by explosions. The 5 Shermans were down to 3. Steel Faith and Lucky Star were gone, their twisted hulls burning on the slope below. But somehow Liberty Bell was still alive. Sergeant Carter knew brute force wouldn't save them now. He switched tactics, not fighting for victory, but for time. "We fight like ghosts," he told his men. "Shoot, move, disappear. Never give them the same target twice." Marino nodded, wiping grime from his eyes. "Copy that. Ghosts it is." They used every trick they knew. Carter ordered smoke rounds fired to blind the German gunners, then reversed into new positions between blasts. Every time the fog cleared, Liberty Bell was gone, firing from another ridge or another barn ruin. The Germans began firing at shadows, wasting shells on empty snowbanks. "Make them think there's more of us," Carter muttered. "That's how we win." Through his periscope, Marino spotted a Panzer IV inching forward through the smoke. He waited for it to turn, revealing its thinner side armor. Then he fired. The shell hit low right under the turret. The explosion was small at first. Then the ammunition inside cooked off, sending flames bursting through the hatches. "Hit confirmed," Marino shouted, reloading. But Liberty Bell wasn't unscathed. A shell detonated near the left track, blowing snow and debris against the hull. Inside, Tommy coughed through the smoke. "Track's holding, but not for long." Carter didn't hesitate. "We move before it breaks. Red, take us to the farmhouse. We'll use it for cover." They roared forward, the Sherman's treads churning the snow as bullets ricocheted off its armor. Machine gun fire clanged against the turret like hail. They burst through the broken fence line and slid behind the half-destroyed farmhouse, using the stone walls as a shield. Tommy pried open the ammo crate. "That's it. 10 rounds left." "Make them count," Carter said. Minutes passed. The Germans regrouped, moving cautiously now. The illusion had worked. They still thought they were facing a full American unit. Carter's radio crackled with faint signals. Allied command, still out of range. No reinforcements, no rescue. Bill, Red said, voice low. We can't keep this up. They'll box us in. Then we'll fight our way out before they do, Carter replied. The next Panzer appeared through the smoke, its gun turning toward the farmhouse. Marino was ready. He fired first. The shell struck the German tank's treads, immobilizing it. The Panzer tried to rotate its turret, but Carter gave the order before it could. He round. Aim for the fuel deck. Marino fired again. The second hit tore the tank apart. The crew inside never made it out. 8 rounds left, Tommy whispered. The radio crackled again, clearer this time. A distant voice, half drowned in static. Hold position. Reinforcements en route. Carter's eyes narrowed. How far? No reply, just static. He turned back to his men. We hold until they get here, however long that takes. For the next half hour, they fought like cornered wolves, repositioning, firing, retreating, and striking again. German shells fell closer with each volley. The farmhouse began to crumble around them. Tommy laughed bitterly as dust rained from the ceiling. If we live through this, drinks are on me. Marino grinned weakly. Only if they're not German. Outside, the enemy was regrouping again. Slower now. Cautious. Unsure. Liberty Bell was running low on ammo, fuel, and hope. But the men inside still breathed, still fought, still held the line. In the chaos, Carter looked through the periscope and saw a Tiger tank halted in the distance, its commander scanning the field with binoculars. For a second, their eyes almost met. 2 men, enemies, both trying to survive the madness. Carter whispered, "You'll have to kill me to take this road." He gave the order. Fire. The shell left the barrel with a crack that split the air, a single shot against an army. And somehow, it hit. By the 3rd hour, the battlefield was a living nightmare. The snow that had blanketed the fields at dawn was gone, replaced by mud, ash, and fire. The smoke was so thick that even the sun seemed afraid to rise above it. Inside Liberty Bell, the temperature climbed past endurance. Sweat mixed with soot on the men's faces, and the metal walls burned to the touch. The roar of the engine blended with the endless thunder of artillery. It felt like the earth itself wanted them buried. Tommy slammed another shell into the breach. "That's 5 left." Marino didn't look up from the scope. "Then we'll kill 5 more." Outside, the German tanks advanced again, slower now, cautious, deliberate, learning from their losses. Carter watched through his periscope as the Tigers repositioned across the valley, using wrecks for cover. They were adapting. Every second, the American advantage of surprise faded. "They're spreading out," he said. "They want to flank us." Red's hands shook on the controls. "Bill, we can't take a hit from those 88s, not even close range." "I know," Carter replied. "That's why they won't get the chance." He keyed the radio to the 2 remaining Shermans. "Hold your fire till they crest the ridge. Then hit the lead Tiger. We drop the head, the body stumbles." Minutes crawled by. The noise built again, the metallic growl of the German formation. Through the fog, Carter could see their silhouettes. 15, 20, maybe more. The ridge trembled under the weight of treads. Marino adjusted his aim. "I've got the lead." Carter whispered, "Fire." The shot landed dead center. The Tiger's turret erupted, a plume of black smoke marking the hit. The German column hesitated just for a second, and the Shermans fired together. Another Panzer burst into flame. "Good hit! Keep it up!" Carter shouted. Then the reply came, a storm of 88mm shells tearing across the ridge. Iron Angel, one of the last Shermans, vanished in an instant, its fuel tank igniting like a sunburst. The blast rocked Liberty Bell, knocking Marino back from the scope. "Angel's gone!" Tommy yelled. Carter grabbed the headset. "Falcon, fall back! Use the wrecks for cover!" But there was no answer. The radio hissed with static. He looked through the periscope and saw Falcon burning in the field below. They were alone. Only Liberty Bell remained. The next shell struck close enough to lift the Sherman's left tread clear off the ground. The crew was thrown sideways. Red grunted as his head struck the periscope housing. Blood ran down his temple. "I'm good," he shouted, forcing a laugh. "Just don't let him get my good side." "Shut up and drive," Marino snapped. Carter looked around the cramped interior. 3 men left, 1 tank, surrounded by fire. "We're not dying in a steel coffin," he said quietly. "We fight until it stops moving. Then we move on foot." Outside, a tiger crested the ridge, its cannon turning toward them. Carter didn't think. He just acted. "He round! Fuel deck!" Marino fired. The shell hit, detonating the tiger's rear armor. The explosion threw debris high into the air. "Direct hit!" Tommy cried. But before he could reload, another German shell slammed into Liberty Bell's right flank. The blast deafened them. The lights went out. Smoke filled the compartment. Red coughed violently. "She's hit bad, Bill." "Evacuate," Carter ordered. Tommy grabbed his sidearm and kicked the hatch open. The cold air outside hit like a slap. They tumbled into the snow, coughing, crawling behind the wreck. The tank still burned, its gun pointed defiantly toward the enemy. For a long moment, the 3 men crouched in the mud, the fire reflecting in their eyes. Above them, the German tanks paused, wary, cautious, expecting another shot. Then Carter, his face blackened with soot, looked at his men. "We held 3 hours," he said. "That's more than command ever asked." Marino managed a grin through bloodied teeth. "And we ain't dead yet." The sound of engines roared again, but this time from behind. American reinforcements. Carter lifted his head toward the noise. Dozens of Shermans appeared over the horizon, cutting through the haze. The cavalry had arrived. He exhaled, finally letting himself believe. "We did it," he whispered. Behind them, Liberty Bell exploded one last time, the final roar of a tank that refused to surrender. When the first American reinforcements rolled over the ridge, it felt unreal, like a hallucination after too many hours of smoke and terror. The familiar silhouettes of Shermans and half-tracks emerged through the haze, sunlight glinting off their armor. Their engines roared not like machines, but like salvation. Sergeant Carter blinked through the grime and blood on his face. "Tell me that's real." Marino nodded, eyes wet. "If it's not, we're all already dead." The first formation of tanks thundered past them, their turrets turning, guns blazing at the retreating German armor. The battlefield erupted again, but this time the thunder was American. The tide had turned. The surviving Panzers broke formation, reversing down the valley under a curtain of Allied fire. For the first time in 3 hours, the air wasn't filled with incoming shells. Just the sound of engines, men shouting orders, and the steady crack of rifles. The Germans were running. Carter collapsed to his knees, the adrenaline finally leaving his body. 3 hours, he muttered. "We just had to hold 3 hours." Tommy sank down beside him, laughing breathlessly. "Guess we're lousy at math." A medic sprinted toward them, ducking behind the burning hulk of Liberty Bell. "You men from that tank?" he asked, glancing at the smoking wreck. Carter nodded. The medic's jaw tightened. "You're lucky. Reinforcements were 30 minutes out. You held longer than anyone thought possible." Marino looked back at what was left of their tank, a scorched carcass, black smoke curling from the turret. He stared for a long time. "She bought us every minute of that," he said softly. The reinforcements cleared the valley, pushing the Germans into full retreat. Broken Panzers littered the snow like metal corpses. The air was thick with the smell of oil, blood, and victory. Carter stood, his legs trembling. "We've got wounded out there," he said to the medic. "And bodies. Good men. Get your people to start collecting." An hour later, the battle was officially over. The field that had been a graveyard of Shermans now swarmed with medics, engineers, and soldiers. Smoke rose from wrecks and snow continued to fall. Quiet, almost merciful, covering the scars of what had just happened. A young lieutenant approached Carter, clipboard in hand. "Sir, command wants to know who was in charge of this sector." Carter wiped his face. "Nobody was in charge. We just refused to die." The lieutenant hesitated, then extended a hand. "Whatever you did here, Sergeant, you stopped 40 tanks with 5. That'll be in the reports." Carter didn't take the hand. He just nodded toward the burning field. "Tell the reports about them," he said quietly. That night, as the temperature dropped and the fires died down, Carter sat beside the remains of Liberty Bell. The tank's gun barrel pointed toward the horizon, still defiant, even in death. Tommy and Marino joined him, silent. They shared what little rations they had left, cold beans, hard bread, and didn't speak for a while. The stars above were clear again, the smoke finally clearing from the valley. Marino broke the silence first. "Think anyone will believe us?" Carter gave a weary smile. "They don't have to. We were there." The sound of engines hummed in the distance. The rest of the division moving forward, chasing what was left of the German armor. The war would go on. But for these men, the front line ended here. Before turning in, Carter took a piece of chalk from his pocket, something he used to mark coordinates, and scrawled words onto the side of Liberty Bell's ruined hull. "She held the line." He stood there for a moment staring at it, then saluted the wreck. As dawn approached, the snow began to fall again, soft, silent, covering the tank and its scars like a white shroud. 2 days later, the men of what was left of Carter's platoon were pulled off the line and sent to the rear for debriefing. They rode in silence in the back of a supply truck, the smell of burned oil and cordite still clinging to their uniforms. None of them spoke. None of them slept. They'd fought longer than any human body should have been able to. At dawn, the truck rolled into a temporary command post, a farmhouse converted into headquarters. Officers and clerks moved like ghosts between radio tables and maps. Outside, the motor pool roared with the sound of refueling tanks and repair crews welding armor. The war machine never stopped. An adjutant stepped up as the men climbed out. "Sergeant Carter?" Carter nodded, his face gray with fatigue. "You and your crew are wanted in the main tent. The colonel's expecting you." The 3 men walked inside, their boots crunching on straw-covered floors. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the sharp tang of ink and oil. Maps of the Ardennes hung across the canvas walls, dotted with red and blue pins. At the center stood Colonel Whitaker, tall, rigid, with the kind of face carved from command itself. He looked up from the table as they entered. "So you're the men from the ridge?" Carter didn't answer. He simply nodded. The colonel studied them for a moment, his eyes lingering on their soot-blackened faces and torn uniforms. "You held against 40 Panzers, 3 hours. Command says you lost 4 tanks." "Yes, sir," Carter said. "We held until the line arrived." Whitaker tapped his finger on the map. "The reinforcements reached the ridge at 1410. If you'd fallen before then, they'd have hit us in the flank. You saved the sector." Marino looked down, uncomfortable. "We were just doing our job, sir." Whitaker gave a dry smile. "Your job was to delay, not to destroy a company of armor." He reached for a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were reconnaissance photos taken after the battle, black and white images showing a valley littered with burning tanks. 38 confirmed kills, he said quietly. "Not bad for 5 Shermans." The men didn't speak. Carter just stared at the photos, the black scars where his friends had died. The colonel closed the folder. "There'll be citations, probably medals. But I want to know one thing, Sergeant. How did you hold that long?" Carter hesitated, then finally said, "We didn't think about dying, sir. We just thought about the next minute. Then the next. The tank did the rest." Whitaker raised an eyebrow. The tank? Carter nodded. Liberty Bell. She never quit. We couldn't either. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. Then he said almost to himself, "That's the kind of war we're fighting now. Not men against men, machines against time." He dismissed them with a salute, one that carried quiet respect. "Get cleaned up, boys. You're off the line for a week. After that, we'll see where you fit next." Outside, the men walked past rows of tanks, some freshly repaired, some wrecked and abandoned. Mechanics swarmed over them, welding, patching, testing engines. Marino stopped and ran a hand along the armor of one newly painted Sherman. "Looks just like her," he said softly. Carter nodded. "Then let's make sure we don't waste what she bought us." They stood there for a long time, the hum of engines filling the cold air. War had a way of erasing moments like theirs, turning sacrifice into statistics. But for these three men, the ridge would never fade. Years later, long after the war had ended and the sound of engines had faded from Europe's skies, Bill Carter returned to the ridge. The land had changed. The trenches were gone, the wreckage cleared, the forests grown back. But when he closed his eyes, he could still hear it. The echo of cannon fire, the grinding of treads, the shouts of men refusing to fall. He was no longer a young sergeant, but a quiet man with gray hair and hands that still shook when thunder rolled. He had come not with a unit, but with a wreath of poppies and a worn photograph of his crew. The French government had placed a small memorial at the site, a simple stone marker half covered by moss. It read, "To the men who held the line." Carter knelt before it. The air was still, save for a soft wind moving through the grass. He laid the photograph at the base of the stone. 5 smiling faces leaning out of Liberty Bell before the battle, unaware that only 3 of them would survive the day. "I told you we'd come back," he whispered. Behind him, a young French farmer approached. "Monsieur Carter?" the man asked in halting English. "You fought here?" "Yes," Carter said, "a long time ago." The farmer nodded toward the ridge. "My grandfather said when he was a boy he saw smoke here for 2 days. He said the Americans stopped the Germans, right there." Carter looked out over the valley. The memory returned with painful clarity. The tigers moving like predators through the mist, the fire that turned the snow black, the smell of diesel and fear. "He's right," Carter said quietly. "We stopped them. But the cost..." He trailed off. The farmer placed a hand over his heart. "My family is here because you did." Carter nodded, his throat tightening. He hadn't come for thanks, but the words struck deeper than he expected. He stayed there until sunset. The light turned the ridge golden, and the stone marker cast a long shadow across the grass. For a moment he imagined hearing laughter again. Marino's wisecracks, Tommy's jokes, the hum of Liberty Bell's engine before it was torn apart. Pulling a small object from his coat pocket, he placed it beside the photo, a brass shell casing engraved with a single word: "Hold." He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked to the horizon. The world had moved on, faster, louder, more complicated. But out here, the line still held, quiet and eternal. As he walked back toward his jeep, he heard footsteps behind him. It was the farmer again, calling out, "Monsieur Carter, one question, please." Carter turned. "Why did you fight so hard? You could have fallen back. You could have lived." Carter thought for a long moment. Then he smiled, tired but certain. "Because someone had to. And because she..." He nodded toward where Liberty Bell had once stood. "Never gave up on us." He drove away slowly, the road winding through the same hills that had once burned with war. Behind him, the ridge glowed in the fading light, quiet and whole again. Bill Carter never wrote a book about the war. He never gave interviews or stood on parade grounds. When people asked what he did in 1944, he just said, "We held." But for the men who'd survived alongside him, for the mechanics who built the Shermans, for the generations that followed, his story became more than a memory. It became a lesson. After returning home to Kansas, Carter worked as a mechanic on farm equipment. He said the sound of engines comforted him. Sometimes, when he fixed an old tractor, he'd run a hand over the metal and say softly, "You'd have liked her, Belle." He married, raised 2 sons, and never stopped teaching them the same truth he'd learned on that frozen ridge, that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to stay when everyone else runs. Years later, his eldest son joined the Army. Before shipping out, he asked his father, "How did you do it, Dad? How did you fight through all that?" Carter didn't answer at first. Then he said, "You don't fight for glory. You fight so the man next to you doesn't have to die alone." In time, the world forgot the ridge. The history books mentioned the battle in passing, a footnote in the long grind across Europe. But among tankers, the legend of Liberty Belle lived on. Mechanics spoke of her like a ghost that refused to die. And veterans told recruits that 5 Shermans once stopped 40 Panzers because they refused to move. Decades later, when a military historian tracked Carter down for an oral history project, he found the old sergeant sitting on a porch overlooking endless fields of wheat. The man looked smaller now, but his eyes were still sharp. "You were there," the historian said. "The stand that held the valley." Carter nodded. "Do you remember what you were thinking in those last minutes?" Carter smiled faintly. "Yeah, I remember thinking the tank was breathing. I remember thinking we weren't fighting the Germans anymore. We were fighting time." The historian hesitated. "And when you finally saw the reinforcements?" Carter's eyes softened. "I didn't feel relief, just quiet. Like the war itself stopped shouting." He leaned back in his chair, the wind moving through the tall grass around them. "Everyone talks about who won the war," he said. "But the truth is, nobody wins a war. You just do your part to make sure the right people get to go home." That night, as the sun set over the plains, Carter took out a small notebook. Inside, in fading pencil, was a single line written decades earlier on the back of a ration wrapper. "Hold until help arrives." He smiled, folded it closed, and whispered, "We did." The war that had defined his youth was gone, but its echoes lived in every free sky, every open field, every quiet morning, untouched by tanks or fear. Because sometimes history isn't written by generals or presidents. It's written by 5 men inside a single tank who refused to let the world fall apart. And in that, Liberty Belle never truly stopped fighting. "Are we to be executed?" Captain Hans Keller whispered to the man beside him. It was July 1944 in Huntsville, Texas. 300 German prisoners, some former officers, some teenage conscripts, were being marched in formation toward an open field. The sun burned through the air like a furnace. Dust rose with every step. They had heard rumors. Americans were unpredictable, friendly one moment, ruthless the next. And this, Keller thought, felt wrong. Too quiet. No guards shouting, no rifles raised, just townsfolk in summer hats standing by long wooden tables under oak trees. Then came the smell. Bacon, cornbread, roasted meat. Keller blinked. The scent hit him like a hallucination. For a second, his war-hardened instincts told him it was a trick, some psychological cruelty before the inevitable punishment. But then a woman's voice called out firm and warm, "Y'all come eat!" The guards didn't move to stop her. Instead, they nodded for the prisoners to sit. Keller's men hesitated. The Americans, farmers, wives, teenagers, were smiling, passing out tin plates and cups of coffee. One young boy ran between tables carrying a basket of biscuits, laughing as if this were a town picnic. A prisoner muttered, "They're mocking us." Another whispered, "No, I think they mean it." Keller's hands trembled as he reached for a slice of bread. The butter melted against his fingers. He hadn't tasted real bread in 2 years. No one spoke for a while. Just the clatter of plates, the murmur of wind through grass, the sound of people eating together, enemies sharing a meal under the same sun. Across the table, an old Texan rancher broke the silence. "You boys worked hard on my land this week," he said. "Figured you earned supper same as any man." Keller didn't know what to say. All his life the enemy had been painted as monsters. Now he was being offered mercy by the very people whose sons he'd fought to kill. That night, in the flickering light of the barracks, he opened his diary and wrote, "Today I learned America's greatest weapon. It is not their guns. It is their grace." That single dinner would ripple far beyond Texas. For some, it was a simple act of kindness. For others, it was the first crack in a wall of hatred that had been built brick by brick through years of war and propaganda. And though no one knew it yet, what happened that day on a dusty Texas field would reshape hundreds of German prisoners' understanding of their enemy and of themselves. Because sometimes the most powerful victory comes not with conquest, but with compassion served on a plate. 2 weeks before that meal, Huntsville, Texas, had been a town living on edge. Word spread that a train full of Nazi prisoners was arriving to work the cotton fields outside town. The newspaper headline was blunt: "Enemy soldiers held near Huntsville." For many locals, that was all they needed to hear. Enemy soldiers, men who had bombed London, who had burned Europe, who might, by rumor and imagination, still wear their iron crosses under their shirts. Ranchers padlocked their barns. Mothers told their children not to go near the fence line. At the feed store, a farmer spat into the dust and said, "If they try anything, I'll shoot first." The town's Baptist preacher, Reverend Wallace, tried to calm the nerves at Sunday service. "The war's far away," he said from the pulpit. "But what we do here still matters. We'll be judged not by our fear, but by how we treat our enemy." Few listened. The fear was too thick. When the trucks rolled in, bringing pale, thin young men in tattered field uniforms, people lined the dirt road to stare. There were no shouts, no curses, just silence, the quiet weight of suspicion. Captain George Miller, the U.S. officer in charge of the POW detachment, stepped out and tipped his hat. "Folks," he said, "these men aren't fanatics. They're soldiers, same as ours, just lost on the wrong side of history." No one answered. Inside the newly built camp, Keller and his fellow officers inspected the barracks. They found clean bunks, soap, even books in German. For men raised under a regime that preached dominance through brutality, it was a shock. That night, Keller wrote home to his wife, Elsa, in Munich. "I am imprisoned, yes, but they feed us, they let us write. They treat us as men, not beasts. Either they are clever liars, or they are not, as the Reich described them." Outside the wire, the fear persisted. Children whispered about the Nazis in the woods. Local gossip claimed the Germans were planning an uprising. Then, one afternoon, a strange thing happened. A thunderstorm hit the camp. Lightning struck the generator. The floodlights went dark. For nearly an hour, the fences were unpowered and the guards stood ready, rifles in hand, waiting for a breakout. But none came. Instead, through the rain, the sound of German voices rose, singing Lili Marleen. The melody drifted over the storm, mournful and human. The guards lowered their rifles. One whispered, "Hell, they sound homesick." That night, something shifted. The myth of the savage enemy began to crumble. The Texans began to realize the truth, that these were not monsters, just men who had seen too much war. And the prisoners, too, began to see something they had never known under Hitler's rule: dignity without fear. It was the first small fracture in the wall that divided conqueror and captive, a fracture that would, before long, let the light through. By 1944, Texas was not just cattle country. It was POW country. Across the Lone Star State, more than 50,000 German prisoners were spread among sprawling compounds of wooden huts, barbed wire, and dusty parade grounds. Camps in Herne, Huntsville, Hereford, and Bastrop turned empty fields into small, self-contained cities of captured soldiers. The United States had captured so many Axis troops in North Africa and Italy that Europe simply couldn't hold them. Texas, with its open land, cheap labor needs, and distance from the coasts, became the perfect place to keep them. Inside each camp, life was governed by strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. Every prisoner received food equivalent to an American soldier's rations: bread, meat, vegetables, coffee, cigarettes. They could write 2 letters a week, attend classes, and even form orchestras and theater groups. For the Texans who lived nearby, it was bewildering. The U.S. was rationing meat and sugar, but enemy prisoners were eating well. One woman wrote in her diary, "My boy fights in France and I can't buy butter. Yet the Germans down the road get milk and cake." Still, the economic need outweighed resentment. The farms and ranches of Texas were starved for manpower. The men had gone to war and the harvests were failing. The Army began leasing POW labor to local farmers, under armed supervision at first, but soon without it. By the fall of 1944, German POWs had contributed over 7 million man-days of labor across the United States, producing nearly 20% of Texas's wartime crop yield. And slowly, something unexpected happened. Farmers who had once feared Nazi devils began inviting the Germans into their kitchens for water and shade. They learned names, stories, even laughter. The Germans, in turn, began sending handmade gifts, wood carvings, paintings, toys for children. In Huntsville, one rancher recalled, "They called me Herr Boss. They worked hard, no complaints. I figured they earned a meal." Inside the camp, officers like Captain Hans Keller noticed how different this America was from the image painted by Hitler's propaganda. There were no whips, no cruelty, only order and efficiency. One day, a U.S. sergeant showed him a newspaper headline: 96,000 American planes built in 1944. The sergeant smiled and said, "We build freedom, same way we build everything else, by the dozen." Keller didn't laugh. He couldn't. That single number was larger than Germany's entire aircraft output for the war. That night he wrote in his journal, "Their power does not come from hatred. It comes from work, from faith, from people who believe in what they are building." By the end of that summer, the Germans were still prisoners, but something fundamental had changed. The barbed wire remained, but so did respect. Because deep in the heart of Texas, a quiet experiment was taking place, to see whether mercy could hold stronger than metal. And soon, one meal in Huntsville would test that belief in front of the entire town. By late August 1944, Huntsville's harvest was nearly done. The Germans had labored in the fields for weeks, quiet, disciplined, and surprisingly grateful for honest work. Some of the Texans had started to soften, calling them the boys rather than the Krauts, but others still seethed. That's when the idea of the supper began. It started with Mrs. Lillian Carter, a rancher's wife known for her fiery temper and her sense of fairness. Her husband's cotton fields had been tended by POWs, and she'd seen firsthand their exhaustion and quiet obedience. One morning, she slammed her hand on the kitchen counter and declared, "Those boys are humans. They've earned a real meal, not just rations." Her husband blinked. "You gonna feed the enemy, Lil?" She replied, "I'm gonna feed men who've been baking under our sun." The idea spread through the church circle. Some thought it was blasphemy. Others thought it was the most Christian thing they could do. By the end of the week, 10 families agreed. They'd cook for every German prisoner working the Huntsville fields. When Captain Miller heard the plan, he nearly refused. "Ma'am, Army regulations forbid unsupervised contact," he warned. "And the last thing I need is a headline that says, 'Texans dine with Nazis.'" But Mrs. Carter didn't flinch. "Captain," she said, You're fighting a war to keep your soul. Don't lose it now." Miller took a long look at her. Then, with a sigh, he signed the paper authorizing a community morale dinner. Preparations began in secret. Local butchers donated meat. Farmers brought corn and beans. The women baked pies through the night. Even the POWs noticed the activity and whispered among themselves. One asked a guard, "What is happening?" The guard just grinned. "You'll see." On the morning of August 28, 1944, a convoy of trucks rolled from the camp to a clearing just outside town. Long wooden tables were set beneath the oak trees. Smoke from the barbecue pits curled into the hot Texas sky. When Keller and his men arrived under guard, they froze. The scene before them looked nothing like a military operation. No rifles, no shouting, just smiling faces, and a preacher standing at a podium, hat in hand. He spoke softly. "We've seen what hate can do across the ocean. Today, let's see what mercy can do here." Some of the Germans bowed their heads in confusion. Others stared at the food, too overwhelmed to move. The Americans didn't wait for orders. They began serving plates: roast beef, potatoes, biscuits, and bacon cooked crisp over mesquite fires. At first, no one ate. Keller's men thought it might be a trap. But then, one young Texan farmhand, barely 19, sat beside a German mechanic and passed him a plate. "You fixed my tractor last week," he said. "Eat." The German hesitated, then nodded. He took a bite. And just like that, the war paused. Forks clattered. Conversations sparked. Laughter hesitated, then returned like a forgotten tune. The Texans realized the enemy wasn't so different after all. And the Germans realized America's strength wasn't cruelty, but kindness that could fill a man more deeply than any ration ever could. That dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a quiet rebellion against the logic of war. And for some, it became the first moment they believed peace was possible. As the Texas sun dipped lower, the air smelled of mesquite smoke and roasted beef. The long tables beneath the oak trees groaned with food. Platters of corn, baked beans, biscuits glazed in butter, and bacon sizzling in iron pans. The heat shimmered, and for the first time since capture, the German POWs weren't under guard with rifles pointed at their backs. The guards stood aside, arms folded, watchful but easy. Captain Hans Keller sat at the end of the first table, his uniform cleaned as best as a prisoner could manage. He couldn't stop staring. Children ran between the tables. Old ranchers tipped their hats to the German officers. One young woman, no older than 20, placed a cup of sweet iced tea before him and said, "You look like you could use this, sir." Keller blinked. No one had called him sir since his surrender in Tunisia. The Texans had done something no one expected. They turned a war into a supper. Reverend Wallace stood again, clearing his throat. "Tonight," he said, "there are no enemies, only men who've seen too much of the devil's work. Let's eat as neighbors under God's sky." The blessing ended, and silence hung in the air, an awkward, heavy silence of hesitation. Then a scraping of metal cut through it. Keller picked up his fork, slowly speared a piece of meat, and took a bite. His eyes closed. The flavor, real beef, seasoned, smoked, cooked to perfection, was almost unbearable. He hadn't tasted anything like it since before the war. Around him, his men began to eat too, cautiously at first, then hungrily. For the Texans, it was strange to watch the enemy savor food with tears in their eyes. One rancher whispered, "I didn't think they'd cry." His wife, standing beside him, replied, "They're not soldiers right now. They're just sons who haven't been home." A German mechanic named Otto folded his hands over his plate. "Back home," he said in broken English to a nearby Texan, "we have not meat for 2 years. My mother, she will not believe this." The Texan grinned. "Then eat for her." By mid-meal, the boundaries had blurred. Guards were eating side by side with prisoners. Cowboys swapped stories with Luftwaffe sergeants. Someone pulled out a harmonica, and within minutes, a few Germans began to hum Lily Marlene. A cowboy recognized the tune and joined with his guitar. Laughter erupted. A young American private nudged his friend. "Ain't it something? Last week we were fighting these fellas, now we're singing with them." Not everyone was comfortable. A few townspeople stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, arms crossed. But even they couldn't deny the strange peace in the air. There was no hatred here, only humanity rediscovered. Keller caught Captain Miller's eye across the table. He raised his glass of sweet tea in a quiet toast. "To Texas," he said simply. Miller nodded back. "To peace." When the plates were cleared and the stars came out, the Germans helped clean the tables. No one ordered them. They just did it, quietly, gratefully. One boy, maybe 18, turned to a Texan farmhand and said softly, "In Germany, I worked for the Reich. Here, I worked for a man who fed me." The farmhand didn't know what to say. He just clapped the German on the shoulder. "Guess that's something, ain't it?" By the time the night was over, the fences between them seemed smaller, thinner, almost unnecessary. That supper didn't end the war, but for the men who sat there under the Texas stars, it ended something else. The idea that kindness was weakness. Because on that night, both sides learned a truth that would outlast every victory or defeat. Mercy, when shared, can break even the hardest walls. What happened that night in Huntsville didn't stay confined to one field or one camp. Word spread, first among guards, then through the Army grapevine, and finally across the fences of Texas. Within weeks, other camps began holding their own community meals. A quiet wave of humanity rolled through the POW system, one barbecue at a time. To understand the impact, you have to look at the math, the collapse math, as historians later called it. The U.S. Army held over 425,000 Axis prisoners across America. At least 50,000 of them were in Texas alone. If even 1% of them experienced an act of mercy like that supper, that meant hundreds of lives were directly touched by something no bullet could achieve: dignity. But it went further. Reports from Army Psychological Services noted a measurable decline in disciplinary incidents after events like these. Escape attempts dropped by 60%, work efficiency rose by 40%, and camp violence, once a chronic issue, fell to nearly zero. Commanders noticed that POWs who were treated with fairness and trust returned it in kind. Captain Miller, in a letter to his superior, wrote, "Sir, I've seen fear keep men quiet, but only respect keeps them honorable." On the farms, Texas ranchers began leaving tools and equipment unguarded, confident the Germans would do their jobs and return to camp voluntarily. In over 100 cases, they did just that. When one group of 5 POWs got lost near Waco, they walked to the nearest farmhouse and asked to be taken back to their unit. The farmer, bewildered, drove them back himself. This wasn't sentimentality. It was efficiency rooted in trust. The U.S. had accidentally discovered that compassion could produce better military results than punishment. Meanwhile, inside Germany, captured letters began to arrive. Keller's wife, Elsa, received one that simply read, "My dearest, they have not chained us. They have fed us. They have sung with us. I cannot explain it, but I think they fight for something different than empire. They fight for decency." That letter, intercepted by Allied censors, later appeared in an internal morale report. The analysts underlined one phrase: "They fight for decency." That was the psychological turning point. The Nazi propaganda machine had told soldiers that capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation. But word of mouth spread faster than ideology. Returning POWs, especially after the war, told their families, America was not what we were told. And that, in turn, began to unravel one of the Reich's most powerful lies, the myth that cruelty was strength. Historian James Withers of the U.S. Army War College later described it this way: "The Germans came to Texas believing they'd meet devils. Instead, they met Texans with barbecue pits. And that did more to dismantle Nazi ideology than any bomb dropped over Berlin." The numbers tell the story clearly. In 1945, as the war ended, 99.7% of German POWs in the U.S. were successfully repatriated without major incident. None of the large Texas camps ever experienced a riot or mass escape after mid-1944, the exact period when these community meals began. The U.S. didn't plan this social experiment, but it worked. And for the Germans, the result was internal collapse, not of morale, but of fanaticism. Captain Keller later said in a post-war interview, "They won us without a single blow. They showed us a better way to be strong." In the math of war, you can measure destruction by tonnage, casualties, and sorties flown. But the math of mercy is different. It's measured in letters home, in shared meals, in the slow erosion of hate. And by that measure, the United States didn't just win the war. It redefined victory. The next morning, the fields outside Huntsville were quiet again. The smoke from the fires had blown away. The tables were bare, the plates stacked, the camp gates locked once more. But something fundamental had changed. Something invisible, yet irreversible. In the barracks, the German POWs lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the supper lingered. The laughter, the harmonica, the clink of plates. For many of them, it was the first night in years without fear. At sunrise, the guards arrived as usual, boots crunching on gravel. But there was no tension now. When Sergeant Dalton, one of the Texans, shouted, "Roll call," the men stood faster, cleaner, sharper. He blinked in surprise. "Well, look at that. The boys are smiling." Captain Keller spent the morning writing in his journal, a small notebook made from torn paper and cardboard. His handwriting was neat, precise, military. He wrote, "The enemy treats us as men. They have food in abundance, and yet they share. They have victory, and yet they show no cruelty. Perhaps that is why they win. The war has taken everything from me, my home, my pride, my command, but this land has given me back something I thought lost: hope." Keller's words weren't unique. Dozens of similar diary entries from POW camps in Texas survive in archives today. In nearly all of them, one theme repeats: astonishment, not at America's weapons, but at its humanity. Private Otto, the mechanic who fixed tractors for the ranchers, sent a censored postcard home. "Tell Mother I am alive. Tell her America's not what they said. The guards gave us bacon, real bacon, and one of them said he prays for peace. Perhaps we should too." When Allied censors read that message, they underlined one line in red: "Perhaps we should too." Even the Army noticed. A report from Camp Hearn's command office read, "Morale among POWs markedly improved following community-hosted suppers. Prisoners show reduced aggression, increased cooperation, and express gratitude. Recommend controlled continuation of such activities." Controlled continuation, bureaucratic language for something much deeper. The Americans didn't realize it then, but these simple acts were reshaping the minds of men raised in a totalitarian system. To the German soldiers, who had lived years under propaganda, the realization was staggering. Their enemies were freer, richer, and kinder than their leaders had ever allowed them to believe. Later interviews with former POWs revealed what the experience meant to them. One Luftwaffe navigator recalled, "We had been told Americans were barbarians, but they treated us with more dignity than our own officers ever had. That broke something inside me, something that had believed in the Reich." Another wrote after the war, "It wasn't the bombs that defeated us. It was the bacon, the kindness, and the laughter. They destroyed the idea that we were superior." Even years later, when those men returned to Germany, they carried those memories. Some became teachers. Others rebuilt towns, refusing to allow hate to take root again. Several of them, like Keller, would eventually correspond with their former captors. One of Keller's letters to Captain Miller survived. It read, "When I was captured, I thought you would strip me of my honor. Instead, you restored it. The Reich taught us to conquer. Texas taught me to be human. Back in Huntsville, the locals remembered the dinner too. It became a quiet legend, never publicized, never written about in newspapers, but passed down in families. Old ranchers would tell their grandchildren, "We fed the enemy once," and that night the war felt smaller. It wasn't just about generosity. It was about identity. For the Texans, it proved that decency didn't belong to any one side. It was the last battlefield, and the only one worth winning. And for the Germans, it was the first glimpse of a world that didn't need chains or flags to prove strength, only a table, a meal, and a little mercy. By late 1944, German mail routes had begun to function again under Allied supervision. Every week, thousands of censored letters left the POW camps of America bound for a broken continent. Among them were dozens from Texas, letters written by men whose worldviews had been quietly rewritten under the wide American sky. When those letters reached Europe, they landed like sparks in the ashes of the Reich. Wives, mothers, and sisters gathered in ruined kitchens, reading words that didn't sound like defeat, but awakening. Elsa Keller, Captain Hans Keller's wife, sat in her freezing apartment in Munich when the letter came. The envelope bore an American postmark, the handwriting familiar but unsteady. She hesitated before opening it, half expecting despair or bitterness. Instead, she read, "My dearest Elsa, the people here are not monsters. They are proud and kind. They eat well, they live freely, and they laugh without fear. They gave me food that I have not seen since we were young. Bacon, bread, and coffee. I could not eat at first. I cried. Elsa, they fight with machines, yes, but also with something greater, decency. Tell our son that strength is not cruelty. Tell him that. Always." She folded the letter slowly, hands trembling. Around her, the neighbors whispered, "Keller says the Americans are humane." In a city where propaganda still echoed from loudspeakers, that one sentence was revolutionary. Soon, others followed. Letters from POWs in Texas described fields of wheat, clean camps, good meals, and guards who called them by name. One wrote, "We work with cows and horses. The cowboys are simple men, but they are free men. Their strength is quiet. I think we will never be the same after this." The Gestapo intercepted some of these letters, branding them defeatist propaganda. But they couldn't stop them all. The words spread, whispered from family to family, carried by wives and soldiers home on leave. For many, it was their first glimpse of a world beyond ideology, a world where compassion didn't mean weakness. Back in Texas, the letters also traveled the other way. Ranchers and guards received replies through Red Cross channels, careful censored notes from the families of the men they had once imprisoned. One note from Bavaria read, "My husband says you treated him like a man. I cannot repay you. But if you ever come to Germany, there will be bread for you." Captain Miller kept that letter folded in his wallet for years. By the spring of 1945, the Army's own intelligence reports began noting the effects. POWs from humane camps were more cooperative in debriefings, more willing to share technical knowledge, and less likely to hold on to Nazi loyalty. One intelligence officer wrote, "We are winning hearts faster than we ever planned to." But not everyone approved. Some U.S. officers complained that such leniency softened the enemy. A few newspapers criticized the idea of spoiling prisoners. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, however, took a different view. In a briefing about POW conduct, he remarked, "The measure of a civilization is not how it treats its friends, but its prisoners." That sentiment, born of experience, not strategy, mirrored what was happening across Texas. The people there hadn't meant to make a statement about democracy. They'd simply done what felt right. But in doing so, they turned hospitality into a weapon more powerful than fear. As Elsa Keller later recalled, "When his letters came, they frightened me, not because of what he said, but because I realized we had believed lies for 10 years. And across the Atlantic, under the roar of bombers and the crumbling of cities, a quiet truth took root in the hearts of thousands of German families. The Americans were not devils. They were human, and that somehow was harder to hate. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the camps across Texas began to empty. The trains that had once brought prisoners in from the ports of New Orleans now carried them back out, eastward, toward a Germany that no longer existed. The Germans packed what little they had: a few shirts, a carved trinket, maybe a photo with an American guard who'd become a friend. But the most valuable thing they carried couldn't be seen. It was the memory of how their enemies had treated them, not as beasts, but as men. Captain Hans Keller stood on the train platform at Camp Huntsville. He had been in Texas for nearly 2 years, long enough for the red clay dust to settle into his boots. The American guard stood in silence as the German prisoners boarded. No jeers, no speeches, just a quiet respect. As the train hissed and began to move, Keller leaned out the window and called to Sergeant Dalton, the Texas guard who had once shared his supper. "Dalton," he shouted over the noise, "tell your people, they taught us how to be human again." Dalton just tipped his hat, eyes wet with something he couldn't say. For the German prisoners, the return journey was a shock. The country they left behind was rubble. Cities bombed flat, bridges gone, railroads twisted like paper. There were no parades waiting for them, no honors for service. Only hunger, ruin, and the haunting silence of defeat. Yet many POWs said later that their time in America had prepared them for this new reality. They had seen how order and hope could survive war, how discipline and freedom could coexist. And they wanted to rebuild their homeland in that image. In small villages across Germany, men who had once been Texas POWs began to appear in civic meetings and local councils. They spoke about organization, efficiency, and respect. To neighbors who had lost faith in everything, they said things like, "You don't need fear to make people work, you need trust." Historians estimate that nearly 5,000 former POWs from Texas camps went on to become engineers, teachers, and civic leaders in post-war West Germany. One of them, Werner Brandt, later founded a trade school near Bremen. When asked where he got his ideas, he said, "From the guards in Texas. They managed men better than our generals ever did." The American Red Cross, which tracked returning prisoners, noted something remarkable. The German POWs repatriated from the United States were less likely to join extremist groups after the war than those held in Soviet or European camps. One report phrased it bluntly: "Humanity works as denazification far better than punishment." Captain Keller returned to Munich, to a city of ruins and ghosts. His wife Elsa met him at the train station, thinner and older but alive. When he handed her the small notebook he'd written in Texas, she read its final line aloud. They fought with decency, and that was their victory. That night, Keller looked out over the darkened skyline of his broken city and whispered, "We will build something like Texas here." In the years that followed, many of those POWs did just that, not literally, but in spirit. They built communities on cooperation, fairness, and the quiet strength they had witnessed in the American South. Decades later, a Texas newspaper ran a short story about one of those men, a former POW who had returned to visit the site of his old camp. When asked why he came back, he said simply, "Because here I learned what freedom tastes like." It wasn't a grand speech or a political statement. It was a truth learned over bacon, barbecue, and kindness. And for the Germans who left Texas, that truth outlived the war. By the time the last German prisoner left Texas in 1946, the war was long over. But something had shifted in the fabric of both nations. The victory America achieved on the battlefield had been measured in tanks, bombers, and tonnage. Yet in the soft soil of Texas, another kind of victory had taken root. One not counted in statistics, but in changed hearts. For the Americans, it had started as duty: feed the prisoners, keep the peace, maintain discipline. But in practice, it had turned into something far more powerful. A demonstration that mercy was not weakness, that kindness could stand taller than flags. The people of those small Texas towns never saw themselves as diplomats or philosophers. They were ranchers, mechanics, housewives, and cooks, ordinary citizens who treated their captives the same way they treated their neighbors. When a German asked for a shovel, they handed him one. When he stumbled, they helped him up. When Christmas came, they invited him to sit at the table. In the ledgers of the U.S. Army, these actions were barely footnotes. But in the diaries of the German POWs, they were revelations. Hundreds wrote home describing the same shock. They have no hatred. They live freely, and they are strong. Historians later found that these letters, copied and passed around in bombed-out Germany, quietly undermined Nazi propaganda. They told a generation raised on fear and domination that power could look like compassion and still win. Decades later, when former POWs were interviewed by American journalists, many of them spoke the same line. We learned democracy not from books, but from Texans. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony of war. The side that kills less but understands more. The side that rebuilds rather than conquers, leaves the deeper mark. Captain Hans Keller's story became symbolic of thousands. His notebook, discovered by his grandson years later, is now preserved in a small museum in Bremen. On its last page, he had written in fading pencil, "I came here as a soldier. I leave as a man." Those words were never meant for an audience, but they captured what happened across an entire continent of hearts. Texas never glorified what it did. There were no parades for the barbecue suppers, no medals for the cowboys who shared cigarettes with prisoners, no speeches for the cooks who served bacon to their enemies. Yet those acts, invisible to history's spotlight, carried more strategic weight than most would ever realize. Because when those German prisoners went home, they told their families not about cruelty, but about decency, not about fear, but about freedom. They became ambassadors of something they hadn't known existed, a civilization that didn't need to prove its strength through domination. That's why, years later, when post-war Germany rebuilt itself into a democracy, some of the same men who'd once sat in Texas camps helped design schools, factories, and local councils modeled on the fairness they'd seen there. It's easy to forget that empires fall, weapons rust, and monuments fade. But human memory, the moral imprint of how one side treated the other, endures far longer. In that sense, Texas didn't just guard prisoners, it changed them. And in changing them, it quietly reshaped the peace that followed. So when we ask who really won the war, maybe the answer isn't found in the battle maps or casualty charts. Maybe it's found in something as simple as a campfire meal between enemies who, for one night, remembered they were men first, soldiers second. That was America's quietest victory.